It was another hot Tuesday morning in Phoenix, and David was already sweating by the time he reached his small restaurant. The Arizona sun was just coming up, but the temperature was already climbing toward what promised to be another scorching. David had owned Golden Spoon Family Restaurant for 15 years now, and he knew the routine by heart. Unlock the back door, turn on the lights, start the coffee, and begin prep for the lunch rush. But this morning was different. As David walked around to the back of his building to check the dumpster area, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. It was a soft whimpering sound, like a child trying not to cry. David paused, listening carefully. There it was again. He walked slowly toward the sound, his key still in his hand. Behind the large green dumpster, partially hidden by some old cardboard boxes and a torn blue tarp, he saw them. A young woman, probably in her 20s, was holding a little boy who couldn't have been more than 3 years old. They were both dirty, their clothes wrinkled and stained. The woman's long black hair was messy, and her eyes were wide with fear when she saw David approaching. "Oh my goodness," David whispered under his breath. The woman immediately pulled her child closer, as if trying to protect him. She said something in Spanish, but David could tell by her tone that she was scared and probably asking him not to hurt them. David had learned some Spanish over the years from his customers, but this woman was speaking so fast and seemed so panicked that he could barely understand her. What he did understand was the word "por favor," which meant please. She kept saying it over and over again. The little boy was staring at David with huge brown eyes. His face was dirty, but David could see tear tracks on his cheeks. The child was holding onto his mother's shirt with tiny fists, and David noticed how thin both of them looked. When was the last time they had eaten a proper meal? David slowly crouched down, trying to make himself less intimidating. "It's okay," he said softly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name is David. This is my restaurant." The woman didn't seem to understand much English, but something in David's tone must have calmed her slightly, because she stopped talking so frantically. She was wearing what looked like traditional clothing, a colorful woven top and a long skirt that had seen better days. David had never seen anything quite like it, and he wondered where she might be from. Looking around their makeshift shelter, David's heart sank. They had so little. There was a small plastic bottle with just a tiny bit of water left, a few pieces of stale bread that looked like they had come from a dumpster, and a thin blanket that was more holes than fabric. How long had they been living like this? The morning sun was getting stronger, and David could see that both the woman and her child were already looking uncomfortable. From the heat, the area behind the restaurant would be like an oven by noon. There was no shade, no protection from the brutal Arizona weather. David made a decision. He stood up slowly and pointed to himself, then to his restaurant. "Food," he said, making eating motions with his hands. "I have food for you and your boy." The woman's eyes filled with tears, but she shook her head vigorously. She seemed to be trying to say that she couldn't pay for food. David held up his hand and shook his head. "No money," he said. "Free. It's free." He disappeared into his restaurant and quickly packed up some leftover rice and beans from the night before, along with some fresh bread rolls he had been planning to use for lunch. He grabbed 2 bottles of water from the cooler and found a clean towel in the supply closet. When David returned, the woman was trying to clean her son's face with the corner of her shirt. The sight broke David's heart. Here was a mother doing her best to take care of her child with absolutely nothing. David set the food containers down a few feet away from them, not wanting to scare them by getting too close. He opened the containers so they could see the food inside, and the little boy's eyes grew even wider. David could actually hear the child's stomach rumbling. "Please," David said, gesturing toward the food. "Eat." The woman looked at David for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Finally, hunger won over fear. She reached for the containers with shaking hands and immediately began feeding her son, making sure he got most of the food while taking only tiny bites herself. David watched them eat, and he felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was more than just pity or sympathy. These weren't just homeless people behind his restaurant. This was a mother who would give her last piece of food to her child. This was a little boy who trusted his mother completely, even in this scary situation. As David headed back to his restaurant to start his workday, he couldn't stop thinking about them. Who were they? How had they ended up behind his restaurant? Where had they come from? And where were they trying to go? The neighbors in this part of town weren't always kind to people who looked different or didn't speak English well. David had heard some of his customers make cruel comments about immigrants, calling them names and saying they didn't belong here. Some people in the area had started referring to anyone who seemed foreign as aliens, as if they weren't even human. But looking at that mother and child, all David could see was a family in trouble. He thought about his own daughter, who lived in California now with her own children. What if something terrible happened and she was alone with her kids? In a foreign country, wouldn't he want someone to show them kindness? As David flipped the open sign on his restaurant door and began his daily routine, he made a promise to himself. Tomorrow morning, he would bring them more food. He didn't know their story yet, and he didn't know how long they planned to stay in that alley. But as long as they were there, he would make sure they didn't go hungry. David had no idea that this simple decision would change not just their lives, but his own life in ways he could never imagine. All he knew was that behind his restaurant, there was a mother trying to protect her child, and that was enough reason for him to help. The lunch rush was busy that day, but David found his mind wandering back to the alley. He hoped they were staying cool somehow. He hoped the food he had given them was enough, and he hoped that tomorrow, when he brought them breakfast, they would still be there and safe. The next morning, David woke up 30 minutes earlier than usual. He had been thinking about the woman and her little boy all night. Were they still there? Had they found somewhere else to go? As he drove to his restaurant in the early morning darkness, his stomach was full of butterflies. When David walked around to the back of his building, he felt relief wash over him. They were still there, huddled together under the same torn tarp. The little boy was sleeping in his mother's arms, and she was awake, watching David with careful eyes. She still looked scared, but not as terrified as yesterday. This time, David had come prepared. He had packed fresh scrambled eggs, warm toast, and orange juice in a thermos. He also brought a clean blanket from his home and some soap so they could wash up using the outdoor water spigot behind his restaurant. "Good morning," David said softly, not wanting to wake the child. The woman nodded at him, and David thought he saw the tiniest hint of a smile. As the days turned into weeks, this became David's morning routine every single day. Before opening his restaurant, he would bring food, clean water, and whatever supplies he thought they might need. Sometimes it was extra clothes he found at thrift stores. Sometimes it was toys for the little boy, whose name he learned was Rico. The woman's name was Rosa. And slowly, very slowly, she began to trust David more through hand gestures. Simple Spanish words that David looked up on his phone, and Rosa's growing English vocabulary. They began to communicate. David learned that Rosa was not from Mexico, as many people assumed. She was from a small mountain village in Guatemala, and she spoke a language called Quiche in addition to Spanish. When David tried to find someone who could translate, he discovered that Rosa's native language was spoken by very few people in Phoenix. Through broken conversations, David pieced together bits of Rosa's story. Something terrible had happened in her village. Rosa would start to explain, then stop, her eyes filling with tears. David never pushed her to share more than she was comfortable with. He understood that some memories were too painful to put into words. What David did learn was that Rosa had been a weaver in her village. She showed him intricate patterns she could create by braiding grass and small pieces of fabric she found in dumpsters. David was amazed by her skill. Even with almost nothing to work with, Rosa created beautiful designs that told stories of mountains and birds and ancient symbols. Rico was getting more comfortable with David too. The 3-year-old had learned to say thank you, David, in clear English, and he would clap his hands excitedly whenever he saw David approaching with breakfast. Rico loved the small toy cars David brought him, and he would spend hours making car sounds and racing them around their small living space. David's employees at the restaurant began to notice his morning routine. Carlos, his cook, asked David why he was always carrying food containers out the back door. David explained about Rosa and Rico, and Carlos immediately wanted to help. Soon, other staff members were contributing too. Maria, the waitress, brought children's clothes her own kids had outgrown. Tony, the dishwasher, offered to teach Rico basic English words. David's wife Linda was more worried. What if someone reports them? She asked David one evening. What if there are legal problems? David understood Linda's concerns, but he couldn't just stop helping. They're not hurting anyone. He told his wife, they're just trying to survive. As summer turned to fall, David noticed changes in Rosa and Rico. Rico was speaking more English every day, mixing it with Spanish in ways that made David smile. Rosa had learned to say good morning, David, and thank you for everything in English that was getting clearer each week. Rosa also insisted on helping however she could. She began cleaning up the area around the dumpster, organizing their few possessions, and even sweeping the back area of David's restaurant. When David told her she didn't need to do this, Rosa shook her head firmly. I help, she said in English. You help me, I help you. The neighbors in the area had different reactions. Some people complained about those foreigners living behind the strip mall. David heard cruel comments from customers sometimes. People referring to Rosa and Rico as aliens because they looked and sounded different from everyone else. But other neighbors were kind. Mrs. Peterson, who owned the flower shop next door, sometimes brought Rosa flowers that were past their prime for selling. Everyone deserves something beautiful, she told David. Father Miguel from the local Catholic church heard about Rosa and Rico through the community. He visited them one morning and was able to speak with Rosa in Spanish after their conversation. Father Miguel pulled David aside. She's been through something terrible. Father Miguel told David quietly, she's afraid to trust anyone in authority. That's why she won't go to shelters or ask for official help. David felt his heart break a little more. How scared must Rosa be to choose living behind a dumpster, over seeking help from organizations designed to assist people like her? As the weather started getting cooler, David began bringing thicker blankets and warmer clothes. He worried about what would happen when winter came to Arizona. The desert got surprisingly cold at night, and their little shelter wouldn't protect them from wind and rain. Rico was growing taller and stronger thanks to regular meals, but he still looked small for his age. David found himself buying extra groceries every week, making sure there was always fresh food to bring to them. Linda stopped questioning the expense when she saw how much it meant to David. One morning in November, David arrived to find Rico drawing in the dirt with a stick. The little boy had drawn a house, stick figures of people, and what looked like the sun. When Rico saw David, he pointed to his drawing excitedly. That's you, David, Rico said in English, pointing to one of the stick figures. That's Mama, that's me, and that's you. David felt tears in his eyes as he looked at the simple drawing. In Rico's picture, they were all standing together in front of a house under a bright sun. It was the drawing of a little boy who dreamed of having a real home and a family. That night, David couldn't stop thinking about Rico's drawing. 8 months had passed since he first found them behind his restaurant. 8 months of daily visits, of watching Rico grow and Rosa slowly heal from whatever trauma had brought them to this place. David realized that somewhere along the way, these daily visits had become the most important part of his day. Rosa and Rico weren't just people he was helping anymore. They felt like family. By December, the morning routine had become as natural as breathing for David. But now it was more than just bringing food. He found himself staying longer each morning, watching Rico play with his toy cars and listening to Rosa practice English, words she had learned from watching other people in the shopping center. Rico had become a chatterbox, switching between Spanish and English in the same sentence. David, Mira, look, he would say, showing off how he could stack empty food containers Into towers. I make casa. I make house. Rosa's English was improving quickly too. She had started asking David questions about everything around them. What is this called? She would ask, pointing to a bird or a cloud or David's car. David realized that Rosa was incredibly intelligent. She remembered every new word he taught her, and she was already starting to put together complex sentences. One cold morning in January, David arrived to find Rico shivering. Despite being wrapped in all their blankets, the little boy tried to be brave, but David could see his lips were turning blue. That's when David made his first big decision that went beyond just bringing food. Come with me, David told Rosa, motioning toward his restaurant. Rosa looked confused and a little scared. She had never been inside any building since David had known her. David unlocked the back door of his restaurant and invited them in, just to get warm, he explained. Just for a little while. Rosa hesitated, but when Rico let out a small cough, she nodded. David led them into the restaurant's kitchen, which was warm and bright. Rico's eyes went wide as he looked around at all the shiny equipment and the big refrigerators. Wow, Rico whispered, his voice full of wonder. Es muy grande. It's so big. David poured hot chocolate into 2 cups and gave Rico some crackers to munch on. Rosa sat quietly, taking in everything around her. David could tell she was amazed by the kitchen, but also nervous about being inside. This is where you make the food? Rosa asked in careful English. Yes, David said. Every day, I cook food here for people who come to eat. Rico pointed to the big stove. You cook there? I do, David said. Would you like to see how I make scrambled eggs? For the next hour, David showed Rico and Rosa around his kitchen. Rico was fascinated by everything, the way the burners made fire, how the refrigerator kept food cold, and especially the big mixer that David used to make bread dough. Rosa was more interested in the spices and ingredients. She smelled different herbs and spices, sometimes recognizing ones that reminded her of cooking back in her village in Guatemala. We use this, she said, holding up some cumin, but different, more strong. That morning changed everything. David realized that Rosa wasn't just someone who needed help. She was someone with knowledge and skills and dreams. When she talked about cooking in Guatemala, her whole face lit up. She described dishes David had never heard of, made with ingredients that grew in the mountains where she came from that day on. When the weather was very cold or very hot, David would invite Rosa and Rico into his restaurant in the early morning before his employees arrived. Rico loved these visits more than anything. He would pretend to be a chef, stirring imaginary soup and announcing, I make breakfast for everyone. Rosa became David's unofficial helper during these morning visits. She noticed when supplies were running low, and she organized things in ways that made David's prep work easier. She had an eye for detail that impressed David, and she never broke or damaged anything, even though she was still learning how all the equipment worked. But it was Rico who really captured David's heart during these winter months. The little boy was like a sponge, absorbing everything around him. He learned the names of all the kitchen tools. He could count to 20 in both English and Spanish. And he had started calling David something that made David's throat tight with emotion. Every time he heard it, Abuelo David, Rico would say, Grandpa David. Rosa had taught Rico that David was like a grandfather to them, someone who took care of them and loved them even though they weren't blood relatives. The first time Rico called him Abuelo David, David had to step outside for a moment to collect himself as winter progressed. David found himself worrying about Rosa and Rico even when he wasn't with them. What did they do all day while he was working? How did they stay warm when the temperature dropped at night? Were there other people who might help them or hurt them? One afternoon, David made another decision that surprised even him. He left his restaurant during the lunch break and walked to the back alley. He found Rosa teaching Rico letters by drawing in the dirt with a stick. A, B, C. Rico was saying proudly, pointing to the wobbly letters his mother had drawn. David sat down next to them in the dirt, not caring that his work clothes were getting dirty. "That's very good, Rico," he said. "You're learning so fast." Rosa looked at David with curiosity. "Why you come now? No morning time." David pulled out a small notebook and pen from his pocket. "I thought maybe we could practice writing on paper instead of dirt," he said. For the next hour, David sat in the alley behind his restaurant, teaching a 3-year-old boy how to write letters and helping his mother learn new English words. It was the first time David had ever closed his restaurant during lunch hours, but he didn't care. His employees could handle things for a while. As David walked back to his restaurant, he realized something that should have scared him but didn't. Rosa and Rico had become the most important part of his day. Not just the morning visits, but thinking about them, worrying about them, planning ways to help them. That evening, David talked to Linda about his growing feelings. "I know it sounds crazy," he told his wife, "but I feel like they're family now." Linda had been watching David over the past months. She had seen how he smiled more, how he talked about Rosa and Rico with such affection. "It doesn't sound crazy," she said quietly. "It sounds like love." February brought the coldest nights Phoenix had seen in years. David started leaving extra blankets and even a small camping heater for Rosa and Rico. He checked weather reports obsessively, worrying about how they would survive if temperatures dropped too low. One morning, David arrived to find Rosa crying. She was trying to hide her tears from Rico, who was still sleeping. But David could see that something was very wrong. "Rosa, what happened?" David asked gently. Through broken English and gestures, Rosa explained that Rico had been coughing all night and felt very hot. When David felt the little boy's forehead, his heart sank. Rico was burning with fever. David looked at Rosa's frightened face, then at Rico's flushed cheeks. He knew that this moment would change everything. Rico needed medical help, and that meant making choices that could put all of them at risk. But as David looked at this little boy who called him Abuelo, who drew pictures of them as a family, who trusted him completely, there was really only one choice to make. "We're going to the doctor," David told Rosa, "right now." David's hands were shaking as he helped Rosa gather their few belongings. Rico was barely awake, his little body hot with fever, and his breathing was shallow and fast. Rosa kept saying words in Spanish that David didn't understand, but he could hear the panic in her voice. "It's okay," David kept saying, as much to calm himself as to comfort Rosa. "We're going to get help. Rico is going to be fine." The drive to the emergency room felt like the longest 20 minutes of David's life. Rosa sat in the back seat, holding Rico close to her chest, whispering what sounded like prayers in her native language. Every few seconds, she would look at David in the rearview mirror with eyes full of fear. David's mind was racing. What would he tell the hospital staff? How would he explain who Rosa and Rico were to him? What if there were questions he couldn't answer? What if helping them got all of them in trouble? But every time David looked at Rico's flushed face in the mirror, all those worries disappeared. This was a sick child who needed help. Nothing else mattered. The emergency room was busy. Even early in the morning, David walked up to the reception desk with Rosa right behind him, Rico limp in her arms. "Please, we need help," David said to the nurse. "This little boy has a very high fever." The nurse, whose name tag read Jennifer, looked at the three of them with professional efficiency. "What's the child's name and date of birth?" David felt Rosa tense up behind him. This was the moment he had been dreading. "His name is Rico," David said, and he paused, then made a decision that surprised even him. "I'm his grandfather." It wasn't technically true, but in David's heart, it felt more honest than any legal document could be. Rico called him Abuelo. He loved this little boy like his own grandson. If that wasn't family, what was? Jennifer asked for insurance information, and David gave his own insurance card. "I'll take care of everything," he told her quietly. Rosa was watching this exchange with wide eyes. David could tell she was amazed that he was claiming them as family, but also terrified of what might happen next. A doctor came out quickly and took Rico into an examination room. David and Rosa followed, and David found himself holding Rosa's hand as they watched the doctor examine Rico. The The little boy was so weak he could barely keep his eyes open. How long has he had this fever? The doctor asked. Since last night, David answered, translating for Rosa, who nodded. Has he been eating and drinking normally? David thought about the simple meals he brought every morning, the basic shelter. Behind his restaurant, he's been eating, but maybe not as much as usual. The doctor was gentle with Rico, listening to his chest and checking his temperature. It looks like he has a pretty serious chest infection, she said. We're going to need to keep him here for a couple of days and give him medicine through N4. Rosa didn't understand all the medical terms, but she understood that Rico would have to stay in the hospital. Her eyes filled with tears, and she started shaking her head. No, she said in English. Rico, come with Mama. David put his arm around Rosa's shoulders. Rosa, Rico needs to stay here to get better. The doctors will take good care of him. But Mama stay too? Rosa asked hopefully. David looked at the doctor, who nodded. Of course, parents can stay with their children. As they moved Rico to a room upstairs, David realized he was committed now. He had claimed Rosa and Rico as family in front of hospital staff. He had given his insurance information. There was no going back. But as David watched, Rosa gently stroked Rico's hair while he slept in the hospital bed. He knew he had made the right choice. This was what family did for each other. For 2 days, David barely left the hospital. He brought Rosa food from his restaurant and clean clothes from his house. He translated between Rosa and the nurses when needed. He read stories to Rico when the little boy was awake enough to listen. On the second night, when Rico's fever finally broke and he was sleeping peacefully, Rosa turned to David with tears in her eyes. David, she said quietly, you saved Rico's life. Any grandfather would do the same thing. David replied. Rosa was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that made David's heart skip a beat. We know can go back to Allie. She said it too. Cold for Rico. To dangerous. David had been thinking the same thing after seeing Rico so sick. The idea of taking them back to live behind his restaurant felt impossible. But he also knew that Rosa had nowhere else to go. Rosa, David said carefully. What if you and Rico didn't have to go back to the alley? Rosa looked at him with confusion. Where we go? David took a deep breath. What he was about to say would change all their lives forever. What if you came home with me? Rosa stared at David for a long time. Home? With you? My house is big, David explained. My daughter moved away years ago, so there are empty bedrooms. You and Rico could stay there. You could be safe and warm, and Rico could get better. Rosa started crying, but David could tell these were different tears. David, I know can. You family, Linda wants to meet you, David said truthfully. He had called his wife from the hospital and explained everything. Linda had been quiet for a moment, then said, bring them home, David. A child belongs in a home, not behind a restaurant. But what people say, Rosa asked, what if trouble? For you? David looked through the hospital room window at Rico, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The little boy's face was relaxed now, no longer flushed with fever. In his sleep, Rico was holding onto a small toy car David had brought him. Rosa, David said. Rico calls me abuelo. You've been teaching him that I'm his grandfather. In my heart, that's exactly what I am. And if I'm his grandfather, then you're my daughter. Family takes care of family. Rosa was crying harder now, but she was also smiling. You really mean this? I really mean this, David said. Come home with me, both of you. The next morning, when the doctor said Rico was well enough to leave the hospital, David helped Rosa pack their few belongings into a small bag. As they walked toward the hospital exit, Rico riding in a wheelchair with a nurse, the little boy looked up at David. Abuelo David, Rico said in a voice that was still a little hoarse, where we going? David knelt down next to the wheelchair and took Rico's small hand in his. We're going home, Mio. We're going to our home. Rico's face broke into the biggest smile David had ever seen. Our home, really, really. David said, you and Mama are coming to live with me and Grandma Linda. as they walked out of the hospital. Together, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years. His heart felt full in a way it hadn't since his own daughter was small, behind his restaurant. He had found to strangers who needed help, but walking toward his car, he wasn't with strangers anymore. He was with his family. The drive to David's house was quiet except for Rico's excited chatter from the back seat. "Mama, look, so many houses." "Abuelo David, which one is ours?" Rosa sat nervously beside her son, smoothing down her hair and straightening her clothes. David could see in the mirror that she was worried about meeting Linda. What if she know like me? Rosa had whispered to David before they left the hospital. "She's going to love you." David had promised, though he felt butterflies in his own stomach. 2. When they pulled into David's driveway, Linda was waiting on the front porch. She had been cooking all morning, filling the house with the smells of fresh bread and soup. As David helped Rosa and Rico out of the car, Linda walked toward them with a warm smile. "You must be Rosa," Linda said gently. "Welcome to our home, Rosa." Looked surprised that Linda spoke to her in Spanish. "Habla español. I'm poquito." Linda replied with a laugh. "A little bit. I've been practicing since David told me about you." Rico, who was feeling much better after his medicine, ran straight to Linda. "Are you Grandma Linda?" he asked in English. "I am," Linda said, kneeling down to Rico's level. "And you must be the famous Rico I've heard so much about." Rico giggled and took Linda's hand. "Abuelo David says we live here now." "That's right," Linda said, standing up and looking at Rosa. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Rosa's eyes filled with tears again. She had been crying so much over the past few days, but these were good tears. "Gracias." She whispered, "Thank you so much." The first few weeks were an adjustment for everyone. Rosa had never lived in a house with electricity and running water that worked all the time. She was amazed by simple things like the washing machine and the microwave. Rico was fascinated by everything: the television, the soft carpets, and especially his own bedroom with a real bed and toys. David and Linda worked together to make Rosa and Rico feel comfortable. They bought Rico new clothes that fit properly and got him enrolled in a preschool program for children learning English. Rosa was shy about going to stores or other public places at first, but Linda was patient, showing her around the neighborhood slowly. The language barrier was challenging sometimes, but the family found ways to communicate. Rico became the best translator, switching between English and Spanish to help everyone understand each other. Rosa's English improved quickly because she was determined to be able to talk to Linda and to help Rico with his schoolwork. Within a month, Rosa insisted on contributing to the household. She couldn't find a regular job without proper documents, but Linda's friends started hiring Rosa to clean their houses. Rosa was thorough and trustworthy, and word spread quickly. Soon, she had more work than she could handle. "I pay you back," Rosa told David one evening, trying to give him money from her cleaning jobs. "Rosa, your family." David said, "Family doesn't pay rent, but I want to help." Rosa insisted, "You do so much for us." David thought for a moment. "Okay, if you want to help, maybe you could teach Linda and me how to cook some of the food from Guatemala. And maybe we could add some of your dishes to the restaurant menu." Rosa's face lit up. "Really? You want to learn my cooking?" That's how Rosa became David's cooking partner. Every Sunday, she would teach David and Linda how to make traditional Guatemalan dishes. Rosa would explain the ingredients and techniques while Linda wrote everything down in a notebook. Rico would help by tasting everything and giving his opinion. "This one is good, Mama," Rico would announce after trying a new recipe, "but needs more cheese." The restaurant customers loved the new menu items. Rosa's tamales became so popular that David had to make them a daily special. Her chicken soup, which she said was good for sick people, sold out every time David made it. 6 months after Rosa and Rico moved in, David made Rosa an official partner in the restaurant. She was there every morning now, working beside David in the kitchen and teaching the other employees her recipes. Carlos, the cook who had been working with David for years, Learn to make Rosa's dishes perfectly. She's a natural, Carlos told David one day. Rosa understands food the way some people understand music. Rico was thriving too. His preschool teacher, Mrs. Johnson, was amazed by how quickly he learned. Rico is reading at a first grade level already. She told David and Rosa during a parent conference, and his English is perfect now. You should be very proud. Rico still called David Abuelo David and Linda Grandma Linda, but now it felt completely natural to everyone, including neighbors and friends. At school events, other parents just assumed David and Linda were Rico's biological grandparents. One evening in November, almost a year after Rico's hospital stay, David found Rosa sitting at the kitchen table working on something with colorful threads. She was weaving, creating intricate patterns just like she used to do in Guatemala. "What are you making?" David asked, sitting down beside her. "A wall hanging for Linda," Rosa said, not looking up from her work, "to say thank you for everything." David watched Rosa's skilled hands moving the threads. "Rosa, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever think about going back to Guatemala?" Rosa was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, "Sometimes I miss my village. I miss the mountains and the people I knew. But David, this is home now. Rico is an American boy now. He dreams in English and Spanish both." "And you?" David asked. "What do you dream in?" Rosa smiled. "I dream in family," she said. "In Guatemala, I had no family left. Here, I have you and Linda and Rico. This is my family now." That Christmas was the best holiday David and Linda had celebrated in years. Rico was excited about everything: the Christmas tree, the presents, and especially the idea of Santa Claus visiting their house. "Santa knows where we live now?" Rico asked David on Christmas Eve. "Santa always knows where good little boys live." David told him, even if they used to live behind restaurants. Rico asked innocently. David's throat got tight. Rico barely remembered their time in the alley now, but sometimes he would ask questions that reminded David of how far they had all come, especially if they used to live behind restaurants. David said, "Santa likes families who take care of each other." On Christmas morning, Rosa gave Linda the wall hanging she had been working on. It showed a family of four people standing in front of a house under a bright sun. Linda recognized the pattern immediately. It was just like the drawing Rico had made in the dirt behind the restaurant 2 years ago. "Rosa, this is beautiful," Linda said, hugging her tightly. "Is our family," Rosa said proudly, "our story." David looked at the wall hanging and thought about the journey that had brought them all together. It had started with a simple decision to bring food to hungry strangers, but it had become something much bigger than charity or kindness. 2 years later, Rico started first grade at the local elementary school. He was fully bilingual now and helped translate for other Spanish-speaking families in their neighborhood. Rosa had become a respected businesswoman, running both her cleaning service and her partnership in David's restaurant. The restaurant had grown too. Rosa's kitchen was now a separate section of the menu, featuring authentic Guatemalan cuisine that people drove across the city to try. Food critics had written articles about the hidden gem, where traditional recipes were prepared by someone who truly understood the culture behind the food. But for David, the most important change wasn't the business success or even the legal documents that had eventually made Rosa and Rico's status secure. The most important change was simpler than that. David's house was full of laughter again. Rico's artwork covered the refrigerator. Rosa's weaving decorated the walls. The dinner table was never quiet because Rico always had stories from school, and Rosa always had news about her customers or ideas for new recipes. Every morning, David still woke up early, but instead of driving alone to his restaurant, he had breakfast with his family first. Rico would practice reading aloud while Rosa packed lunch for everyone. Linda would remind David about Rico's soccer game or Rosa's English class sometimes. When David was working in his restaurant kitchen with Rosa beside him, he would remember that first morning when he found her and Rico behind the dumpster. He would think about how scared they all were, Rosa and Rico afraid of being hurt, and David afraid of making the wrong choice. Now David knew there had been no choice to make at all. When you find family, you don't choose to love them, you just do. And love, David had learned, always finds a way to make room for itself, whether behind a restaurant or in a house or in hearts that are willing to grow bigger than they ever thought possible.